Well, good evening and welcome to this live stream on the 23rd of July 2024. It's Martin North here from Digital Finance Analytics. Great to have you on this evening. We're going to have a really interesting economically based conversation, but as I said to Cameron a little while ago, this is looking at it slightly differently from some of the mainstream cash for comment economists that are out there. So we're going to get into some very significant and important issues. Just before I bring him in, as normal, let me just remind you that we're not providing specific financial or legal or anything else in terms of advice, general conversation only. We do moderate the chat, but feel free to put your questions and comments in. If there's specific issues you'd like Cameron to talk about, to throw those in too. And use that Walk the World. That'll get the question into the queue, get my attention. And I've enabled Super Chat, which means that you can get your question top of the list, or indeed make a contribution to what we do around here. Always greatly appreciated. We do this not for profit, but because we think it's really important to have some of these more frank conversations about economics and related issues, because a lot of the stuff that's out there, frankly, doesn't get to the heart of the issues. And with that, let me bring Cameron in. Cameron, good to see you back again. How are you going?
I'm great. Thanks for having me back, Martin.
It's been a while, but you've been a busy boy. It looks to me as though fresh economic thinking is really taking off. And, you've got now a very steady stream of really insightful stuff coming out. How's it going as an independent voice out there?
I think intellectually so far, very satisfying to have no one there to insulate my views. I do have some trusted people who I send my draft ideas to make sure I'm not going crazy. But it's nice to be able to think as clearly as I can physically think about a topic without worrying about, what does someone else think about that? What does that group think about that? Do I have to stick with the party line or the corporate line or the university line? Intellectually very satisfying. It's slowly building up support. So if anyone wants to go to fresheconomicthinking.com, you can become a paid subscriber. You get access to the audiobook of The Great Housing Hijack, the charts page, the audiobook of Rigged, and all the paid articles. Every second week is a paid article, and every other week is a free article for everyone. So it's really good, actually, Martin. And I think there's room in Australia for new thinkers and new platforms for conversation like you have, like I'm starting, and like quite a few others are starting as well. There's just this real gap outside the mainstream for these views, and I think people want to hear it.
I have now put up Fresh Economic Thinking, and it's quite easy to find it. It's www.fresheconomicthinking.com. And as an independent writer and economist on some really, really important issues, this is a real goldmine of stuff. I really enjoy reading what you do here. Material is very, very powerful that you've created, and it covers a whole bunch of different issues. But what I find fascinating is the way that you are looking at the information from new eyes. I almost feel as though you are deliberately wanting to say, no, look, hang on, there's a different way to think about this, right? And I want to touch on that a little bit this evening around superannuation, and maybe we'll talk about nuclear, and maybe we'll talk about GDP per capita. Because the thing I'm amazed about is that most economists are, I think, in herd mode. They all sort of march in step, lemming-like. They almost think the same things, like, gross GDP is the way to measure the success of the economy. We need people like you with an independent voice and a different way of thinking to bring us back to a much more sensible view as to what's really going on.
Yeah, well, thanks, Martin. But I do actually find it puzzling, because a lot of what I say is really uncontroversial economics. It's really out of the textbooks and shouldn't be controversial. But the more I've written, the more I've been an economist for 15 years, going on 20 years now. Now that I think about it, the more I participate in this debate, the more I realize people have this criticism. Oh, you're just saying it's economics 101. It's not that simple. A lot of people actually aren't doing that. A lot of people are just making it up and telling convenient stories that get them attention. And superannuation is one of those. I remember teaching a macroeconomics class, and we had to talk about pensions, and everyone said, you know, we had the UN, the World Bank, a lot of national governments all say, oh, you have to have this pre-saved, they call it a pay-as-you-go system, or a pre-saved system for superannuation. But the textbook actually says nothing. Like, the pre-saving in the textbooks is actually filling up sheds with cans of beans and cars for the future. It's literally producing stuff today that you don't consume and saving for the future. It's not money in bank accounts. It's not trading ownership of shares or property, because that's not in any of the models. So I had a real hard time teaching macroeconomics and saying, well, the textbook says this. Everyone's just making something up that's not in the textbook about pensions. What are we to make of this? Right. And that's sort of one of my big issues that I write about regularly about superannuation. We're sort of not having an economics textbook conversation. We're having a sort of almost just make it up as you go conversation. And the more topics I get into, the more I realize that a lot of areas of our public policy are not grounded in any coherent, rigorous theory. They just make it up as you go and win by pure volume and repetition of stories. So super nuclear, you name it. You will get all these types of discussions at Fresh Economic Thinking and here for the rest of this hour or so.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the point about DFA is what we try to do is to bring some different voices and different opinions to help people turn the Rubik's Cube and just think a little bit differently about how things, not wanting people to automatically change their views, but at least question. And I think that if we can help people question and look at some of the base assumptions that people make. I mean, I had Steve Keen on a few weeks ago, and of course, Steve is very, very keen on people understanding that a lot of people in economics are wedded to a particular false narrative of the way the economy works, right? And it's it's the neoliberal, it's the debt-driven, all of those things. And when you start turning the Rubik's Cube around and looking at it differently, you realize that some of the assumptions that people are flying with just don't work. They just are not real. And that's a real, well, on one case, because on one side of the fence, you can say, well, that's quite refreshing. On the other, it's quite uncertaining. You feel less certain about things because the pillars that you were taught as the way things are isn't actually the way things are.
You're totally right. I think I wrote about that this week, about how I changed my mind on nuclear power. And the pitch in this story was how it's not what I learned, it's how hard it was for me to change my mind when I saw a different viewpoint or realized my reasoning was inconsistent. And I'll share one of the anecdotes is that back in 2013 or 2012, I was doing my PhD with Paul Freiters at UQ, and we were having lunch and we are having this conversation. And I was saying, there's a lot of grey corruption in the energy sector and mining, and we got onto nuclear, and it must have been something about my demeanor, but I must have just shifted from my sort of analytic mode to my social mode. And I kept saying, it's bad because of this, it's bad because of that. And Paul's like, whoa. You can't just pick and choose arguments. You have to examine one argument from top to bottom. Does it make sense? Is it consistent? Where's the evidence? And then take the next one and also check if that next argument is consistent with your previous one. You can't just argue opposite things. And that happens quite a lot. People will argue that, rent control is pretty topical right now in the US. And they will argue, rent control reduces supply, but also encourages people to redevelop rent-controlled housing. Well, isn't that more supply? Like, people get kicked out, like you diminish the stock of rent-controlled housing because you can redevelop those homes. That's adding to supply, right? So you can't say it's not adding to supply and it's also adding to supply, but you don't like it when you formulate it this way. You do like it when you formulate it this way. And this happens everywhere, everywhere. It's astonishing. My point being that once you've seen it once, and then once you've seen yourself do it twice, and once you've seen yourself do it 3 times, you can actually embrace that feeling of, well, I don't really know. Everything's hard to know. But what I can do is embrace the uncertainty and take arguments, each one on their merit, without having a sort of horse in the race. And that's what I'm trying to do now. And as I've got older, I'm still getting less certain. There's that chart of the valley of uncertainty. I'm still going down it. I'm still going down it. 3 economics degrees, probably 25 academic papers, 2 books, hundreds of articles, and I'm still realizing how little I know.
Well, I'll tell you, I'm a philosopher by training, right? And, I did quite a few years academically in philosophy. And the thing about philosophy is that it teaches you that you need to go on asking the next question, the next question, the next question, and you ask the why question. And if somebody says something to you, then you say, yeah, but why are they saying what they're saying? What is the underlying assumptions that they're actually bringing to the party? And, I did the philosophy of language. So, when you have a conversation about an elephant, how do you know? And I know that an elephant's an elephant, right? And there's a series of assumptions that we both have about what an elephant is to make the conversation work, right? The same absolutely is true when you look at finance or you look at economics, right? The fundamental questions are often, what are the assumptions that people are making to lead them to make the statement that they're making? And, there's a certain well-known commentator who keeps saying the RBA is going to cut, the RBA is going to cut. There's nothing to see here, right? And it's like, yeah, but you've got to understand, what is the assumption that he's making? Why is he doing what he's doing? And then when you actually sort of stand back and say, hang on a moment, let's understand about the dynamics, what's going on. Let's understand the position of power and how power plays into that. And your earlier work on the crony capitalism and everything else is part of that. There's a series of other things that people need to understand when people say what they say, why do they say what they say, and what do they really mean, and do they really know what they're talking about?
I'm totally with you, and most of the time, no is the answer. So I'm actually these days trying to be a lot more cautious about what I say as well and what I claim. And I've got a few draft articles actually where I say, this is the limit to what we know. Like we know these things. I think this might be possible, but we don't really know. Everyone who claims they know this is beyond the limit of our collective knowledge, because I've read every academic paper on this topic and no one actually knows. So, it's hard though. It takes a lot of training to be honest like that.
And also to admit sometimes you don't know what the answer is, right? That's the other thing that I find. The number of times when I've asked people, to explore something with me, and I realize that they're actually making it up as they go along. They actually don't know the answer, but they actually are not prepared to be adult enough to say, actually, I don't know. Good question. I'll go and find out, right? Then you get the old BS indicator starting to go over there, and you think, okay. Well, now let's go into a couple of specific areas where there's plenty of BS around. Super is one of those things, right? Now, superannuation, the Keating Initiative, going back 20 or 30 years, of course, most people had either no savings for old age or they had a company scheme. The company scheme took the risk quite often. It was a final income-related scheme, so they carried that through. And there are only a very small number of people now who are on final income schemes. The other scheme came in, mandatory contributions. We've now got 35 billion a year in fees taken out of the superannuation system. We've got something like 3.5 trillion of assets compared with 10 trillion in property. We've got people putting massive amounts of money into superannuation. The superannuation funds, of course, are growing like you wouldn't believe. But I guess the question is, who are the winners and who are the losers? And what is super really about?
This is one of those areas where my views changed a lot, and probably started changing, as I said, trying to teach economics 12 or 13 years ago, and realizing the way we talk about retirement savings and the way our macro models talk about savings, that it's the same word. It's the same word, doesn't mean the same thing, right? One is trading cash for an existing asset, a property, shares, treasury bond. And the other one is building new machines to increase the rate of production. So buildings, bridges, machines, etc. They're different things. And so we've had this debate for a long time now on super that we need to save. The economics says we need to save. And it's true, we need to invest to grow the economy, but that's not what super does. Super is just essentially getting paid two streams with your income. One goes into bank account A, and one goes into bank account B. Okay, now what happens? Well, bank account B, we're allowed to speculate in asset markets. We can buy property, we can buy shares, we can buy treasury bonds, we can buy Bitcoin. We can speculate on the currency, whatever we want to do. And the other share of our bank balance we can spend on ourselves. The issue I have with super is two big things. One, it doesn't do what it says, right? It doesn't provide you retirement income if you don't have any money in retirement. Because you want a retirement income that insures you against being old and not having money, right? You can spend your super at age 60 for 7 years. You can even upgrade your house with your super and then get the age pension, as not most, but I would say many people are advised to do, right? Spend your super, get the age pension. So if we're allowed to spend our super when, before retirement age, how is that a retirement system? It also doesn't do what it says of smoothing what economists call lifetime income. So it doesn't take money off you when you're rich and give it to you when you're poor. It takes money off you when you're poor and young, because most young people are poor, and young families are the most financially stressed households, not age pensioners. And it gives you back money when you don't need it because you're already old, and old people are richer on average. And if you could save a lot in super, you could also save a lot outside of super, right? Like, it's not like it's giving anyone extra money. If you had enough to earn super over your life, you had enough to save a little over your life. If you didn't work, if you were disabled, if you were a carer for a family member for your working life, what are you meant to do, right? It doesn't solve that problem. And they're the people who are in poverty and renting in old age. So it doesn't do what it says. The age pension does do what it says. The age pension is just a social insurance system. We all pitch in. People live different ages, and people have different amounts of money. And some people lose their life savings when they retire. And if that's you, you get a share to keep you out of poverty in retirement. The age pension does everything we want, right? And your typical age pensioner is more financially secure than your typical, 4-person household renting aged under 30. And so I'm like, okay, people are complaining the age pension's not enough. Are we happy that most families age under 30 have worse incomes than this group that is apparently so poor? I don't know. We need to reconcile that. So it doesn't do what it does. The second main way that I've shifted on super is that it's extremely costly, right? It transfers about 40 billion of income to retired people currently. There's about another 40 that's taken as lump sums, typically before retirement. So age 57 it used to be, but now 60. So you can just take that, you buy a caravan, you do your trip. I'm like, is that what super was for? Right? Take your lump sum, go on a European cruise. So it's still, I think, more than half of withdrawals from super come as lump sum payments. It's just literally people taking it out and spending it on whatever they feel like. Okay, that's fine. But are we really spending $30+ billion in fees each year for a system that does that? When the age pension is administered for just a few $1 billion, pays over 40 billion every year, right, in incomes to people who need it, keeps them out of poverty, and is administered for a tiny amount of money. And yet the super system costs 35 billion in fees and only gives out 40 billion in incomes. How does that work? You're basically paying dollar for dollar a fee, right, into the system. Now, and then here's the weird economics of it. People compare the value of the assets held in super accounts to the management costs, the administrative burden on the economy. But that's not what you should compare. It doesn't matter what's in those accounts, whether they go up and down of value. If they were valued at zero, it wouldn't matter. If it was valued at zero and still produced 40 billion of cash flow, well, it produced 40 billion. That's the retirement income. That's the output of the system, right? And so people go, oh, there's 3.5 trillion in super and it only costs 30 billion. I'm like, that's not the right comparison, right? The age pension, right? We could create value by turning the age pension system into a every Australian citizen would get a pension bond, right? So you pay your tax, everyone gets a pension bond, and a pension bond's worth exactly the present value of your age pension, right? You could trade them maybe and get a market price. We could add all that up and stick the number in a spreadsheet and say, hey, right, the age pension system, it's pre-funded to, $1 trillion. We're all good to go. So yeah, people misunderstand. They think the cost is not high because they compare it to this asset price, not the actual social function that it's doing. They also think there's some kind of magic about compound interest, right? They're like, yeah, but the age pension, that's just a payment. Compound interest, that's a special magical payment, right? That goes up over time. And here I am thinking, it's pretty funny, right? The same sort of, especially, politically right wing, but what does anything mean in politics anymore? People go, oh, there's no magic money tree. Governments can't spend, there's no magic money tree. But compound interest, that's a magic money tree, right? Just put your money here, there's a magic money tree there. I'm like, whoa, hang on a minute. So there is a magic money tree. It's called compound interest. And what's really funny, compound interest comes from the economy. It compounds because the economy grows over time. We might say, oh, look, we're getting 8%, 9% compounding. Well, that's kind of nominal. Okay. You've got to also convert for inflation. And guess what? You're kind of growing at the speed of the economy. That's what compound interest should do. But do you know what else grows at the speed of the economy? Our ability to tax out of the economy and support age pensioners. So if compound interest is a real magic money tree, then guess what? Tax system accesses the same magic money tree. Or it's not a magic money tree, and then, of course, your argument for super falls over. So I'm sort of like got to the point where I'm like, so we've got this age pension system that is super cheap to administer, keeps everyone out of poverty. There's a few issues around home ownership because, home ownership is sort of an asset. You don't have to pay rent. That's your sort of return in retirement. So, renting age pensioners is a bit of an issue, but most age pensioners are homeowners. That's a really good functioning insurance system. It seems weird to me if I had a really good car insurance policy that I would then also be forced to compulsorily put 10% of my income in a special bank account in case I crash my car when I've already got car insurance. But that's what super does. And we know, double insurance, it's inefficient, it's wasteful, but apparently for age pensions, it's not. So all of these things I've learned digging into it. Oh, the other sort of thing, sorry, to go back to my first point, it doesn't do what it says. People think it's keeping a lot of people off the age pension, but it's really not. It's mostly the people who could already save voluntarily for retirement and who did voluntarily save for retirement, taking that money that they would have voluntarily saved and not getting taxed on it, and by putting it through super, right? And then there's the bottom section of people who, have patchy work lives because they're carers or parents or anything else, right? Or they're disabled or whatever the case may be. And they're not getting helped by it because by the end of their career, they don't really have much anyway. And they'll take it as a lump sum at age 60 and get on the pension. So there's a tiny, tiny sliver, a few percentages of households who are actually sort of shifting off the pension onto the part pension or off the part pension onto the full pension. So in terms of budgetary effects, it's really nothing to it. You're giving huge tax breaks. For every dollar in tax breaks, maybe you're saving 50 cents in age pension. What's that? So where's the economics here? So take these all together, and this information is not hard to find if you want to find out and you want to question, like we were talking about, Martin. If you want to question why, right, and not just accept the story on super, you can do that and find all this out. And surely people have. And the question for me then is, why isn't there an abolish superannuation lobby? If all this information exists, I can find it out. Your audience can find it out. My audience at Fresh Economic Thinking can find it out. Where is the abolish super? Don't people want their own money to spend when they're young and they've got kids and they're alive? I mean, 1 in 7 men are dead before they can get super. Like, where's the logic? We want people to be rich and happy rather than poor when they're young? And you can, funnily enough, the new data, I don't know if you've seen it, Martin, on the change in spending of different age households. I know Tarek has shared it a few times. You know, people aged under 35 haven't had real spending gains for 5 years. People aged over 65 have had massive real income gains and spending gains. And we keep talking as if people over 65 need more money and people under 35 need less money for some reason. I don't get it. Anyway. So that's superannuation. That's what happens when you keep asking why, Martin. You go down this rabbit hole, you learn all this stuff and realize that was a terrible system. You know, there are also 55,000 people. I'm not sure if I wrote a report a couple of years ago, and there's some analysis that 55,000 people work in superannuation, and only like 6,000 or 7,000 work in Centrelink. Not just for the age pension, but for the whole administrative apparatus, right? So we're talking it's nearly 10 Centrelinks to get a super system of people. And what's funny, that's about how many people are in the total defense forces in Australia. So we've got like a standing army of spreadsheet monkeys trading the same assets with each other to doubly insure old people compulsorily who don't need the money by taking money when you're young and poor and need the money. And it just does my head in that, we can't kind of see the system for what it is. Anyway, so I'm out there now, wherever I can, trying to inform people about this. Have you changed your view on that, or
I've always had the view that it was the intervention of the state and how I save my money is a problem, because I actually believe in personal freedom. I also believe that at the time when you are younger, your priorities are quite different from when they're older. And being forced to effectively siphon off a proportion of your overall income at the time when you need it for other things is a bit dumb. I also believe that you need to train and educate people to help them understand why saving is important, because I believe that the savings discipline is important, but being forced to do it is not actually a good way to encourage people to understand about financial responsibility.
Yeah, well, actually, there's some Reserve Bank research about 10 years ago that found it crowded out a lot of savings, right? Yeah. What we mean by that is that high-income earners are going to save automatically because they're in high-income earning periods of their life and they don't need to spend every dollar. And so they, buy a share portfolio, whatever the case may be. Now they've got super, they do the same thing, but they get a tax break for it. It didn't change their behavior at all. So that's what the crowding out is. So you're right. And here's the other thing. There's this sort of, I call it the sacrifice impulse. Saving is good, sacrificing is good. Now, there is an economic benefit to saving because you get a buffer stock, right? You lose your job, you go, we're all right for 6 months. I can shop around and get a good job. I don't have to cancel the holiday. Don't have to take the kids out of sport. That's what saving is for, right? But all those reasons you would want to save for those life events, super, you can't actually use it as a savings buffer, right? Only until the bank is about to take your house and you can't pay the mortgage, or only till you got a medical condition that's life-threatening, you're going to kill you. Oh, now you can use your savings buffer. I'm like, but hang on a minute. you've taken away all the good things about saving and having a buffer by not letting me spend it during those times when I've got a newborn baby or my wife's not working or I've just bought a house and I want to dump some money in because I got a new job. These are the benefits of saving while you're young and alive and making all those big important decisions and changes. When you're 66, it's going to be 67 on the age pension, you've got a car, you've got a house, your kids are all grown up. A lot of age pensioners still go on a lot of overseas holidays in Australia, right? Because you can also have a few $100,000 in cash or whatever the number is. It's it's a bizarre world. So if anyone's listening and wants to start the abolish superannuation lobby, there used to be a website, Workers Against Super. I don't think it's up anymore, but these are the reasons. And the other thing, I'm just going to rant a little bit more if that's all right, Martin.
Go for it. That's what this show's for.
People have this idea that savings is good because it generates more capital investment. Okay, so here's another economic sort of argument that gets dug up, and probably another example of how we just have hidden assumptions. So people go, well, yeah, but the economy will grow faster because we're all forced to save. And yet, the 2010s, the big conversation in economics was, there's a global savings glut. People need to spend their money because we can't get growth because people aren't spending money. There's a savings glut. And then during COVID, we said, do you know what's really good? What would kickstart the economy? If people spent their money, right? Because no one's going to build new buildings and build new factories unless someone's buying the products, right? The causality is really demand driven, right? There's a bit of an argument about that, but I think when push comes to shove, everyone agrees. People don't build cruise ships unless someone orders a cruise ship to be built, right? It's demand for buying them. People don't build buildings unless someone's ordered it to be built through their demand. And so during COVID, we said, we need to stimulate the economy and investment. What do? Let's give people some of their super so they'll spend it. And then when they spend it on holidays and goods and services, we'll get more housing construction, more retail expansion. I'm like, hang on a minute. 2 years ago, people were saying super makes the economy grow because we don't spend the money. Now we're saying super makes the economy grow when we do spend the money. Like, pick one, please. So, I don't find that argument convincing. I think saving has merit for individuals, for sure, for this buffer stock purpose through their lifetime, right? But so does, insurance serves this function too, right? So pensions we've solved with a national insurance. We could just call it national insurance if you want, right? We solve it with our cars and our houses with insurance. You don't need it's not good just because saving. It's good for a purpose. And super doesn't have that purpose or function.
No, I agree. And when I talk to people in my surveys, they don't feel as though the pension is, or your superannuation is really a savings vehicle that they have any control over at all. They just feel as though somebody's
That's true.
Open your wallet, taking the money out before we ever see it, right? But that doesn't give you the discipline. The other point here is there's a thing called risk transference going on here, right? Going back 20 or 30 years, the risk was always that the company might not be able to pay out the income. But now the risk transference is on the individual whose pension superannuation assets are sitting in various assets, and if the market drops, your future security drops. Now that's a deliberate intent in my view. There was a deliberate intent to shift the risk away from one sector of the economy to another sector of the economy. Right? That's my theory. Other point though is, if you actually think about how this is now playing out with this massive amount of money sitting in superannuation, guess what? The government's got itchy fingers, right? So it started by taxing, more than 3 million in superannuation. They're talking about redirecting some of those super funds into the home building sector. It's almost like that big shiny thing that's got all this money. We want to get our hands on it again. So it's actually messing with government behavior as well.
Yeah, you're right. There's some strange political incentives. This is a funny thing though. It's not a pot of money. It's a claim on ownership of BHP shares and US Treasury bonds and everything else. And this is what we saw during COVID when people took their money out. They had to go and sell all these assets to get cash from someone else. from somewhere in the economy. And so the government's like, oh, it's money just sitting there. It's not money, right? It's Apple shares, BHP shares, Commonwealth Bank shares, right? If you want to spend it, you got to sell those shares to someone else to get money, just as you would if you issued treasury bonds. So, yeah, it's a bit of a strange one. I find the argument that I don't trust that the age pension will be here in 20 years or 30 years, but I'll trust the super. Yet you've just said the government's tempted to get their fingers in the super pie. I'm like, it's the same, right? The political incentives are the same. If you don't want to pay old people, you don't. Whether it's the pension or whether it's spending super or requiring super to go to certain things. I don't see how a huge, 40 to $50 billion tax break compulsory savings scheme is safe from future governments when an age pension that directly goes to 1.6 million voting households is somehow a huge risk. So I think there's a bit of a misreading of the politics. And I'm going to have a stab while we're on super to the Labour Party, who have spread all these crazy economic stories for many years about super. Like, absolutely amazes me that the party of the worker likes compulsory private retirement savings and not collective public retirement insurance. And like, what's happening with this topsy-turvy politics here, right? I can assure you, if we've gotten a time machine and Paul Keating wasn't a big super advocate, but it was a Liberal Party leader, the Labour Party would be completely opposed and would have a whole bunch of different stories about super and how privatised retirement is just a huge scam and a tax break and it's padding the pockets of the banks and all these fund managers, which it is, right? But the wrong party introduced it. And funnily enough, while I'm having a dig at Labour, they're the ones that actually raised the pension age to 67 too. Like, this is like a right-wing crazy extreme right-wing retirement policy from the Labour Party, and yet our politics sort of happens as if it's the opposite, that it's this communist collective system. Like, it's really bizarre. So you've got to make a big effort to take a step away from political sides if you want to understand super.
Well, a couple of observations there. Of course, the neoliberal philosophy, which is let the markets be the markets. We need to build up the financial system and allow it to dominate everything. And that's a doctrine that both sides of politics actually hold to. And that's partly because of the way the Treasury operates, and partly because my view is that the two major parties in Australia are very close together on most things. The other point here, and somebody in the chat made the point, a lot of those funds are flowing into some of these very large international investment funds like BlackRock and what have you, right? So it's part of an institutional process where there is massive amounts of money sloshing around in the system. And it is worth just reflecting that there's massive amounts of money sloshing around in the system at the time when world debt has never been higher. And I think it's just worth thinking about this from a liquidity standpoint. So if I show you this one, this is actually the world debt. Currently, it's never been as high as it is at the moment, and it's continuing to rise, right? So there's a broader issue here about the flow of liquidity. Liquidity then blows up assets, the value of assets, be it property, be it shares. So there's almost a sort of a self-perpetuation machine in the middle of this as well.
Do you think, Martin, there's a risk of a sort of tightening of liquidity and governments tightening their belts, issuing less debt, lower returns on bonds or whatever the case may be? Do you think there's a risk of super is part of this international financial machine? We've expanded these balance sheets. There's a lots of debt. Do you think it's now exposed to the same risks as all the I guess it is by design exposed to all those market risks? If I remember the 2008, 2009 financial crash, the value of super went down 20%.
Yeah.
Right. And everyone's like, oh no, it's real money in there. It's special stuff for our retirement. I'm like, you just lost 20% of it.
Exactly.
Right?
Yes.
It's not real money. It's claims on ownership of things that may or may not happen and, produce value in the future.
So in terms of will the governments wean them off more debt, that's the first part of the question, right? And if you look at Biden in the US or, the UK, we've now got 100% of GDP in terms of debt in the UK, and it's still going to rise higher. Australia is going the same way. It seems to me that whilst governments may talk about wanting to clamp down on debt, the truth is they probably won't. The second point is, of course, the cost of debt is much higher now, and that's putting a huge impost on servicing the debt that's there. And I'm fascinated by the way that the Treasury in the US has been pumping more and more and more liquidity into the system. At the same time, the central bank's turning down the liquidity, so that they're pulling in two different directions. So the first question is, will they ever wean themselves off this greater liquidity? No. But if they do, then the whole thing just goes pop.
Yeah, exactly. The balance sheets will contract. No, that's why they won't. They can slow down the rate at which debt grows, and certain countries at certain periods, like Australia during the 2000s, might have, periods of nominal GDP expansion, export growth, and pay down some debts. But I don't think there's there's no political urgency, and I don't know if it's I don't know if it's any more of a risk of anything else. I mean, those debts are just assets in someone's savings account somewhere, some treasury bonds.
Well, just to be really clear, it's a book entry, right? So you've got part of government issuing the debt, another part of government buying the debt, or other parties out there buying the debt. It's a series of entries that is magiting money out of nowhere. But,
correct. I mean, and that's why we got so much inflation recently, right?
Exactly.
Like, every country did it all at once.
Yes.
and intentionally so, to generate economic activity. And we did get a lot of economic activity, but of course we got inflation. Kind of a textbook shock, we would call it. Hang on. Sorry. Look, so in terms of, I don't think the reverse will start happening anytime soon. I think we've seen a little bit of, how do I put it? There is a lot more risk trying to contract the balance sheet in terms of accelerating recession than I think expanding it, because inflation can kind of wash through and prices adjust pretty well, but downwards nominally, not so much. So I don't see it as a big risk.
The other point there is that inflation reduces the real value of debt outstanding. So actually, whatever governments may say about wanting to keep inflation low, they actually benefit from high inflation.
For all debtors, right? Like, a lot of mortgage holders are pretty happy that their wages are up 15% or whatever the case may be. Or there's a lot of inflation. It made their 2018 mortgage seem pretty cheap right now. Especially having a period with low interest rates in amongst that inflation. So you're totally right. It does deflate the debt away. And I think we've sort of seen a little bit of that happen. I don't know what's coming next, though. That's, I'm going to admit my limit there.
The question is, can they go on ad infinitum? And my view is there is nothing to stop this continued expansion until somebody says, hang on a moment, but what is the value of a dollar, right? The fact is your dollar and my dollar is being devalued. So when you talk about inflation adjusted returns, they are very different from the non-inflation adjusted returns. So in real terms, what it means is that actually, despite the fact that your superannuation may be growing, it's not growing as fast in real terms as you might think it is, right?
Yeah, so I'm going to put something, I think you're right. So that's sort of the side effect of inflating the debt away. You sort of inflate away all asset values unless for some reason they keep up. But I'm actually going to suggest to you that the next 50 years will be different from the last 50 years in terms of overall returns to assets. I think growth in general will be harder to come by because of demographics globally. We had a really interesting period where the boomers and the boomers' children were both in the workforce the last sort of 20 years, but now the boomers are dropping out. And there's still literally a lump in the age pyramid. So I suspect that will just generally slow down the expansion of the economy globally.
Mm.
So yeah, maybe real returns. The idea that super used to get 8% nominally, 5% real returns might end up being 2% real for a long period. It's a risk. I don't know if it's how likely it is, but it's a scenario that I think is worth keeping in mind.
Yeah, and of course it goes back to this other point that you know people are always talking about intervening. So this came in the other day. Well, maybe we should include family homes in the pension test, right? The government should consider including family homes above 2.1 million in the age pension. This is from the Actuaries Institute. But I thought Matt Barry's comment was pretty amazing here. Actuaries Institute literally promising to take pensions away from old people if they don't move out of homes to make way for more migrants. There'll be whole suburbs where they won't be able to live. Or as Edwin said, and where are they going to go? And the more that you see this stuff, the more you think you can't make this stuff up. How can just
that's an odd one. This whole idea that old people need to free up the homes. I mean, everyone dies. I know we don't like to think about it, but those homes will be free. Someone else will live in them. The housing stock churns over continuously. It's really okay. And I think some of this debate reflects a hidden assumption about the value of stability versus the value of my assumption about what the efficient market outcome should be, right? Some people have this assumption that if an efficient market would, allocate houses based on need, not price. Oh, okay, that sounds not like a market outcome. And therefore, we must encourage that outcome by taxing here or there. And others will say, well, isn't stability a valuable thing? Isn't that why people like to stay in the same suburb, especially old people who know all their neighbors? Like, isn't stability a valuable thing for them to have as old people? And I think I'm more on the latter. I think we underestimate the value of stability in economics and go, we need more efficiency. We need to trade that for that. I'm like, yeah, eventually these things get traded, but stability has a value as well.
Well, it's interesting because in my survey, there's about 1.2 million down traders. So these are people who have large properties and would quite like to be able to actually maybe get something smaller, easier to look after. But the number one reason why they don't is they can't find something in the similar area to where they are, which is smaller and more manageable. It's not about the economics. It's the lack of supply of the right types of property. And in fact, the most critical issue for many people is to stay in an area that they know, with people that they know, with friends that they've got. And that's one of the reasons why people don't actually move into smaller properties. It's not just a purely economic argument. It's about, lifestyle and, as you say, maintaining stability.
Yeah, you're right. There are actually organizations out there that match up students with old people to work around the house for them and for room and board and things like that. And I think those are also good options to have in the market if people want to stay in their home but find the upkeep quite difficult. The sociable old people can get a young person in to help mow the lawn, do the dishes, and hang out the washing and this sort of thing, and stay where they are, and also have interesting conversations. So I think we adapt, and we if there's not the perfect low set place in 2 streets away, people find alternatives.
Yeah, good point. Now let's move the conversation on to another very interesting topic, right? Because you put out some article recently saying, I've changed my view on nuclear. And it's interesting that, nuclear has really bubbled up to the surface over the last couple of months. And, you can say maybe this is partly the political play from the conservative side of politics. It's partly a question about the energy transition and all of those things. But I think it's worth exploring this whole issue, because there's a lot of, frankly, rubbish being spoken left, right, and centre about this. So explain a little bit about how your thinking has morphed and how you've got to where you've got to with regard to nuclear.
Yeah, well, let me tell you where I started, which was reading Helen Caldicott, the anti-nuclear advocate, and really worrying about nuclear waste. And I really sort of, without thinking about it, had taken on board any negative argument for nuclear power. And so it was, as I said earlier in the conversation, I was having lunch with Paul Frieders during my PhD, and he sort of called me up contradicting myself, using two opposite arguments to argue the same thing. And I remember that feeling of, oh, geez, I can just make two completely contradictory arguments because I like to think a certain way about a thing. I wonder what else I don't know that I think I know. And that was actually the start of not just nuclear, but lots, training my brain to think that way. Another example in nuclear was I was contracted by the Conservation Council to do a report on why a nuclear waste dump in South Australia was a bad idea. So for the last 10 years, Australia's been trying to find a location for the radioactive waste management facility, it's called, which essentially just has, clothes, computers, furniture, rubble from Woomera, office equipment from the Lucas Heights reactor, but no spent fuel or anything. And they just want to put it in some boxes in a shed with some security. And, it's been such a controversial topic. So the Conservation Council asked me to write a report about why it's a really bad thing. There must be an economic argument here. I'm like, okay, well, why don't I look into it? I don't like nuclear power, so I'll find something. And I looked into it and I didn't really find anything. And I asked them, I said, okay, so we've got this nuclear waste. We have a reactor. They did lots of nuclear testing at Woomera. Lots of people have waste. I've looked at waste dumps around the world. They seem to be fine. What's your solution? Like, where do you want to put the waste that would go here? That is apparently really bad to put here. And they said, oh, we should leave it at Lucas Heights in Sydney at the reactor site. And I just thought, I don't understand. You're telling me it's a really, really bad thing for nuclear waste to be in the South Australian desert, but it's a really, really good thing that it's in suburban Sydney. Where's the logic? Like, how does this make sense? Like, people live 500 meters away to Lucas Heights, lots of suburbs of Sydney. There's a golf course just down the road. And you're saying that's a superior location for nuclear waste than in the desert. And if it's in the desert, it would be an economic catastrophe. I'm like, I don't understand. What else have you not thought through about this? And then I realized that, spent fuel, I thought was a real problem. And we'd shifted our fuel from the reactor to France. And France reprocesses it and uses it in their breeder reactors to make more fuel, right? More enriched uranium or whatever the jingo is, more uranium that's got enough radioactive activity in it to sustain a reaction. That wipes off a lot of the radioactivity of the fuel, and then they shipped it back. And I just thought, that's like a really good system. Spent fuel is kind of like another fuel if you invest in the technology, and you can actually do this multiple times. In Japan, I think they do quite a few reuses of the nuclear fuel cycle. And then I realized that there's so little waste, you can just keep the waste at the nuclear site and reuse it. And as technology improves, reuse it again. Like, there's just so little of it. I think there's this idea that penetrates environmental thinking that the economy and our future for society might collapse. So we have to be ready today in case they collapse and they can't manage a nuclear facility, right? There's always this like, oh, just in case, we forget how to do this and everything comes crumbling down, we should do this, But I think the more optimistic take is probably in the future we'll be even better at running these facilities and even better at managing waste and even better at reusing it. I don't think the world is going to collapse and we'll become incapable of dealing with it. So there's that as well. And then the last thing that's changed my mind is recently the push, and Aidan Morrison, a mate of mine who's a physicist and now at the CIS looking at energy policy, he explained to me that because renewables are unreliable, like they're not just that they're cyclical, but they're unpredictable in when you get them. You have to invest so much in shifting energy through time and through space, different locations with transmission, and through time with battery storage or firming with gas, that that once you get a certain amount in the system, it becomes exponentially more expensive to add more of that unpredictable, unreliable energy because you have to shift it around so much. And that's why there's so many mega transmission projects, the Snowy 2.0 pumped hydro, all these sort of projects that add to the cost of energy that aren't generation, but are only required in a system with variable and unpredictable generation. Whereas in a system with reliable, stable generation, even if it's all coal power, like essentially we used to be, you don't need all those extra transmission lines and extra gas to back things up. So that was sort of convincing. And then, sort of the final straw was the UAE just brought their fourth reactor online, which took about 14 years. I was pretty convinced by the time delay argument. Oh, it's going to take 15 years, then 20 years. But then I realized the French nuclear rollout and the Korean nuclear rollout, you don't build one, turn it on, and then pour the slab for the next. You pour the slab for the first one, right? Then the next guys come in, and then the guys who poured the slab go to the next site and pour the slab. So actually, they get turned on in this parallel production process, and you get good at it, like the French did and the Koreans. So I've really sort of done a 180. I mean, I'm open to being convinced that enough firming and transmission is going to still make solar cheaper. But I think we'll actually find a similar pushback, environmental pushback, when all of our, beautiful mountains and ridges are covered in wind turbines and there's solar farms in all these agricultural communities. I think you'll find that, as we're finding now, people will also start pushing back and going, no solar in my backyard, no wind in my backyard, just like, happened to nuclear. So yeah, it's sort of it's been really, really interesting to go from in that lobbyist mindset or in that crusader mindset on nuclear and shift into that sort of engineer, economist, analyst mindset and go, oh, okay, that's a real constraint. Oh, okay, that's a real problem. Oh, okay, it's kind of expensive in the UK. Is that, is there a reason for that can be overcome with policy change, or is that something fundamental about the technology? Oh, okay, well, the Koreans can do it, so it's not fundamentally about the technology. You work through those why questions, like you said, Martin, and you go, it's probably a good idea. And I don't know if it's probably true that the coalition's proposal to have publicly owned and run is the only way to kickstart something like that. It's kind of funny to me that a lot of lefties are now saying, oh, you can't, that's an indication that it's a bad thing to do because the private sector won't do it. You're proposing that the government runs it. And that's, being used by otherwise lefty groups to say that that's the indicator of a bad investment. Whereas go talk to them about, any other policy they like. Oh, the government should just build that. The government should do that. I'm like, so that's not an argument, right? So we're back to where we were again. Is this technology realistic? Are there constraints, political constraints that can be overcome? Are there physical and cost constraints that we're not recognizing of the alternative? Do we want to have lots of cheap energy, or do we want to be energy constrained? Do we want to rely on lots of gas? A lot of the people who campaign against gas are also, we need lots more renewables. I'm like, but that means more gas, because this, the supply of renewables goes like this unpredictably through the day, and to fill those gaps means more gas. So how are you campaigning against gas and for more renewables? It's the same thing. If you want your electricity to stay on, you need both together. So that's sort of my story. That's kind of a long-winded way to say it. Sorry, everyone. I hope you're still with us. But yeah, it's sort of a technical journey and an intellectual journey and an emotional journey, going from that campaigner, crusader mindset into this analytical mindset. And maybe that's why I call my thing fresh economic thinking. It's just like, it's a different way of thinking.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me that it is the Conservative side who suggested that it should be a government-driven incentive, right? Going back to this, which side of
Yeah,
politics is, you think, well, hang on, that's very interesting. But in the UK, the
exactly.
reason that the costs have actually accelerated is frankly very poor management of the programs rather than something
Yeah,
fundamentally wrong with the technology, right? And
yeah,
I guess the new next generation, smaller, more modular reactors, and people like Rolls-Royce are looking at those at the moment, thinking, well, maybe it is a more replicable set of elements that we can build and develop. So we're smarter now than we were years and years ago. And
yeah,
I think we need to come off our ideological high horses here and think more rationally about what is the right energy mix for the future, right? Not least given the fact that now with the amount of artificial intelligence related technology that's going to
yeah,
be deployed, the amount of fuel that we're going to need is much, much
yeah,
higher. Energy is much, much higher. I think it's double what people were thinking just 2 or 3 years ago. That's another factor
yep,
for people to bear in mind. So if you want some of this
yeah.
highfalutin technology stuff, you need more energy.
The electrification revolution, again, it's similar people saying, oh, we need all renewables, plus we need to electrify everything. And I'm like, whoa, do you really understand the engineering of what that means? And we're still going to need just a lot of just base load just pumping out, even if we have this renewables and matching the demand through the day. And you know, to go back to this consistent thinking, back in probably 2005, people were telling me, "Oh, nuclear is no good, right? It's too, it's the waste is an issue. It's too risky." Um, they were saying we need to go solar, but at the time, solar wasn't cheap, right? So it's funny how the argument has shifted. At the time, solar was the most expensive, and they said, "No, we've got to subsidize people into solar. We're going to subsidize into rooftop solar." And I don't know if you remember, Martin, but in the sort of 2005 to 2010 period, it was the biggest rooftop solar boom. People were paid $8,000 to put a 1 kilowatt system on their roof. I got one of those grants. Literally, we poured money at the most efficient um, energy generation, unreliable, can't knock people back. Then we subsidized their feed-ins. I had a near 50 cent per kilowatt hour feed-in tariff when the price was like 16 cents. So I paid more than 3 times the price for what I put in and what I took out, plus 8 grand for the system. And apparently there's 170,000 homes in Queensland still getting 44 cents feed-in tariff when the price is 20 cents. And back then, nobody who wanted renewables said, no, we should go for what's cheapest. No one said it's too slow, too expensive, too uneconomic. They said the opposite because they liked solar then and they didn't have that economic argument. They still like solar now. Now they've got a different argument, right? There's no consistency then. And what happened in 20 years is the price really plummeted. And I can assure you, if the whole world wasn't subsidizing rooftop solar, but was doing replicable nuclear rollouts from the early 2000s to now, nuclear would be a lot cheaper too. That was the argument. Oh, we've got to start somewhere with solar. It'll get cheaper over time. Oh, nuclear that will never happen with that. I'm like, well, okay, why? Right? You can't just pick and choose assumptions. You had the opposite argument 20 years ago when I had this conversation, when we could have committed to nuclear and been in the middle of the biggest rollout of nuclear ever. Now you've switched to a different argument. And so the more I see these contradictory arguments and the longer I sort of observe the conversation and see people switching arguments to maintain their position, well, the more I start asking those why questions and sort of questioning my views as well.
Yeah. And there's plenty of switching going on wherever you look. And it becomes an ideological, we don't want this because we don't want this, rather than actually the more methodical piece of thinking that says, well, hang on a moment, let's take it step by step by step by step. And that, I think, is part of the issue. And by the way, governments don't necessarily often back the best solutions, right? It becomes an ideological thing that they then decide to support. So it's almost like they then find the spreadsheets to support their view, but it's that way around rather than the other way around.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that's what, as I said, Aidan Morrison, who's a mate of mine, has actually read. He's the type of guy that reads every spreadsheet and he checks every calculation. And he just said, you guys are inventing things to create a spreadsheet to give you this outcome, especially in terms of the cost of all the distribution, transmission, firming for renewables. So, look, I just think if you just take a high level perspective, one, lots more energy in the future will be needed, and mostly electricity if we're doing electrify everything. Two, nuclear is the most energy dense, very, very safe, and is not polluting. So that seems good. And three, it doesn't have all the problems of intermittency and unreliability. And so you can sort of locate them where we have coal-fired power and put lots of reactors on the same site. And they last a long time. And I feel like as a high-level thing, that's kind of where you want to go the next, many decades. As a high-level thing, do we just want to keep pushing out wind and solar into more marginal locations with more and more transmission and more battery storage? I think you'll see. Look, we'll do this again in 10 years, but my prediction is in 10 years' time, 2034, when we come back and do this, there'll be a world record fast construction of a new nuclear plant, and there'll be the biggest rollout underway of new nuclear since the 1970s. If we come back in the early 2030s and talk, that's sort of my prediction.
We'll put that in the diary, and we'll have a show then. I'm sure we'll see making shows. Interesting. Now let's just move on briefly to my third area, because you put out a post very recently saying, look at Canada's GDP per capita, it's gone nowhere, right? And this is part of a much more interesting discussion about how you measure the success of an economy. And of course, a lot of the mainstreams talk about the GDP, and it's important that goes up. But the GDP per capita, which is actually how the value is shared, is pretty important. In fact, if you adjust that for inflation as well, then you might get to a better understanding of what's really going on. And I think this is a really important conversation about how we measure, what we measure. And again, why is it that economists are fixated on just the GDP number?
Again, this is one of those situations where economists aren't really adhering to their textbooks or their core beliefs here. India's got a very, very large GDP, much bigger than Australia's, but its GDP per capita is something like a seventh of Australia's, right? So it's clearly we're a richer country, and that, it's very obvious that adding more people but producing less per person makes you poorer, not richer. Makes you bigger, but poorer, right? We don't need to be bigger. No, there's no economics of, there should be 20 million Australians or 40 million. There's nothing like that in the textbooks, but there is a lot on how to get richer and making investments, being a productive economy. That's what it's all about. And so I tweeted yesterday, maybe the day before, about Canada. There was a recent study from Stats Canada, and talking about this crazy decline in real GDP per capita. And it was essentially the same as it was 10 years ago, or it was 9 years ago, end of 2014, beginning of 2024, 58,100 Canadian dollars per capita in real terms. And I just thought, how is anyone happy with this? How is anyone not concerned? But of course, they've had more immigration than we have recently. And so the headline number doesn't look too bad, right? So the political debate functions on, we're, boosting the economy, something about the economy. I'm like, the economy is people, right? It's just all of us added up, and we're doing worse. You're just adding more of us, right? So it's really bizarre. Now, there's sort of two ways you can interpret that. One, there's some fundamental issue going on in Canada. And I think, the boost in immigration during a sort of soft economic period is really not very good. An optimistic take is that, oh, this will revert to mean somehow. Don't know the mechanism exactly, but now that all those fresh people are here, they will start being very productive, and that will accelerate the growth back to trend. Maybe that's true. Or maybe the number of people arriving just keeps going and you never seem to catch up to that trend. And then the question is, well, hang on a minute. What's a good policy outcome? Catching up to the trend in 10 years and being poor for 8 years and having 2 or 3 years of rapid growth? I mean, not sure if that's better than being richer sooner for existing residents. So it's really a strange thing. I suspect, look, I'm speculating now, but in New Zealand, there's a bit of a recession at the moment. And what you find is maybe not going to be the same in Canada, but Kiwis are moving to Australia to avoid the recession. And so that's sort of keeping up their GDP per capita a little compared to, I think, if there were Canada, where, you can't just, there's no pressure release valve of people freely able to migrate to the US or anything like that. So yeah, I feel kind of sad for the Canadians at the moment. Compared to Australia, Australia's not doing great the last few years, but if you look at us over a decade, much better than the Canadians. But we have the same issue of just the last 18 months, especially, of just lots of people coming in, but reasonably soft activity, and then hence diluting all of the production we make amongst more people.
Yeah, and just on that, here's the latest data on the migration. And I'll just make the point. Tarek Brooker actually compiled some monthly data very recently to show what was going on. But basically, we've got massive amounts of migration, nearly a million over the last 2 years, and way over the 260,000 that the Treasury was forecasting just a few months ago. So whether that is because we have, a lot of students may not now be there, but other people are coming in. And there's an interesting little piece of data that also showed that actually some of this was expats coming back too. So there's been quite a record number of Australians returning from overseas, which could also potentially thwart the low migration. So I think it's a really interesting observation that if you don't have the right measure, your policy set often takes you down a rather weird route, right? And that's the problem. We're not measuring things right. So what that means effectively is we end up with bad policies.
It's a weird thing though. Like, everyone in Treasury can divide the GDP by the number of people. Like, it's not it's not hard to do. So it's a little bit weird to me that this concept is being corrupted. And I was a bit relieved to hear during the financial crisis, that a few people like Leith and myself were saying, well, a per capita recession is probably the right way to measure a recession, So, sort of shifting the debate to say, hey, it actually matters per person. This whole idea of the aggregate being in a recession is going to be very difficult if you're getting, 2% population growth a year. Very hard to overcome that. I'm sort of glad that the conversation's shifting. One interesting thing that on that graph there, Martin, is, the decline during COVID. A lot of people say, oh, it's just catch up. It's just catch up. But of course, it is in a way, like, if you zoom out and go, yeah, okay, there's some natural force at play that likes to sustain this rate. And so it's like a spring, you pull it down, then it's going to go up, and then before it eventually levels off. But, when we drive and we have to slow down in traffic, we're not allowed to catch up by speeding, right? Because we know speeding has risks. If you got to go slower, you give up that time because we don't like the risks that come with going faster. And I think that's a better analogy for what's going on here. We're catching up. Yeah, the guy speeding in the school zone is catching up. Doesn't mean it's not risky just because he's catching up. It's equally as risky whether it was catch up or just any sudden increase up to 260,000 per year, whatever that number was. But it was 1 million over 2 years, right? So I think that's the better way to do it. Markets adjust slowly. And so these rapid changes come with risks. They come with pressures in the rental market. Right? They come with this decline in GDP per capita. They come with pressures in even provision of public services, right? It's sort of, people go, oh, there was a report, do you remember earlier this year? We need 90,000 people to come and build the homes, 90,000 extra laborers. I'm like, but 90,000 laborers need 40,000 extra homes. And because it takes more than one person, 1 year of one person's work to build a home, right? They can't even build the homes they need to live in, right? Because it takes more than 1 year's labor of one person to build a house. So you're actually going backwards, right? You can't just solve this problem. There's this, it's like this mathematical make believe, right? Because we had 200,000 people that couldn't build enough homes for themselves. Now we're going to have 290,000 that can't build enough for themselves, right? So just, moderation is the key on this topic. We've got to give the markets time to adjust, the housing markets and people relocating and building more homes. We've got to give, the public budgets and the investment cycle in, to build the schools, duplicate all the public services, expand those things. This is a process. It takes time. People look historically, this is an argument I've heard. Oh, well, we had really rapid growth in the 60s or the 70s. There were a couple of periods there of very rapid growth. But if you read about the urban conditions in those periods, a lot of new suburbs didn't have sealed roads, didn't have stormwater, didn't have sewer, didn't have schools. Schools went to use churches in the weekdays because that's churches happen to be vacant on the weekdays, but they're very busy on Sunday, right? We couldn't keep up, right? It actually took a huge amount of effort to make public investments, to seal the roads, to put sewers in the cities and catch up. And now we expect much, much more of this durable capital and this high level of public service. So it's even harder for us to expand at those speeds. So I think there's this weird, there's a taboo, right? You can't talk about immigration unless you're a racist. But if you want to keep that taboo and not talk about it, well, and keep the floodgates open and really not understand people's concerns, I can tell you it's going to backfire politically. People are mostly reasonable and moderate about these things, but if you push them, they will push back. And I don't know if the European elections, the results there were influenced by the huge immigration there, which is not super high compared to Australia, but I suspect the Canadian elections will be heavily influenced by the recent immigration as well. So I guess it's just a plea to be reasonable and understand there are limits to how quickly we can adjust. It's fine to want to have people and grow, but let's do it in a economical way, right? Not the most costly and haphazard way we can think of.
Absolutely. And it's interesting that Leith, who you mentioned, published on the other day some analysis to show that the bulk of the people who were coming in were going into the government sector. So it was actually growing that sector of the economy, right, which is questionably less productive, which is an interesting observation as to where people end up.
That's right. I mean, it's immigration policies. It's one of those other things where the public conversation is detached from the data that exists. And so you have talk about the skilled migration program. But of course, even in the skilled program, you have dependents and spouses and children. Fine. But the average income is below the average Australian wage for unskilled as well, right? It's really not skilled. It's just young. And so, maybe that's a good thing, but there's this sort of distraction out there that we're importing skills that we can't create ourselves. We're not importing nuclear physicists and people who know how to build nuclear plants, right? Because we definitely don't want them. We are importing a few doctors and we are importing a few academics, but these are not niche skills. It's not like, if you go to the Middle East or you go to South Asia and they import engineers and doctors from the US and Europe, that's really importing skills and paying for experts to help you build gas turbines, build nuclear power, build hospitals. That's really high skills. We have a lot of Uber drivers and food delivery people on skilled worker visas. So Yeah, that's just another one of those things where the way we talk about it and what the data shows for the last 10 years is very, very different.
Yeah, and that's, I guess, the message from today's show, isn't it? That, if you start asking those harder questions and peeling back the onion, then the story that is often presented by the high-level media commentary and some of the other stuff that's out there turns out to be not the complete picture. And I'm afraid that some of our mainstream economists are not doing us much of a service because they're just going along with the crowd and not wanting to touch some of these critical issues. And for me, these are, important third rail issues because it goes back to what is the nature of our society going to be, how are we going to power it, and how are we going to pay for ourselves? I mean, these are all big questions, right?
Yeah. And this, you're right. I think you're totally right. These are big questions. I want people to be informed if they want to participate, but it's very, very hard to do because of this relentless storytelling, these taboo questions that we're not allowed to ask. But yeah, so like you, I'm out there trying to peel back the onion and take a look for myself. And I think, the more people that do that, the better. I'm a huge fan of sortition or, being elected by lottery to the upper house, right? Instead of electing people, we should, like a jury, get them by lottery because I actually trust people who've got the time and motivation to be inquisitive and dig into a detail to come to a reasonable view. I trust that much more than people who have status on the line and like reciting the stories of their tribe. But I think there's change happening, and I'm very supportive of more people doing their own research like that.
Well, Cameron, thank you very much indeed for spending some time with us. Just to remind everybody, Fresh Economic Thinking is your website. People can subscribe there, join up, and get pearls of wisdom on a regular basis, and I do recommend that. And really appreciate the time you spent this evening. We must do it again sometime down the track because what I love about this is we can do some quite deep dives into some really important issues, but also make some broader points about what's really going on and how the cookie is being made. And I think these are really important discussions, particularly in the current environment. So thank you very much indeed.
Yeah. No, thank you, Martin. I suspect the next couple of years will be very interesting economically. In Canada, New Zealand, Australia. So yeah, let's touch base regularly.
Look forward to that. And thank you very much. I'm going to take you offline now and I'm going to close the show. Take care. So there you go, folks. I hope you enjoyed that. That was a really very exciting conversation with Cameron. At least I found it, so I hope you did too. Just to say that next week, Robbie Barr will be back on. We're going to catch up on the cash ban and the regional banking inquiry and a whole bunch of other things that have played out in recent times. So join me for that. Just before I go, the dogs, well, a dog, Luna's now reached over and taken both beds, but she's still here and asleep, so that's good. And I'll look forward to seeing you on the live show next Tuesday, same time, same place. Look forward to seeing you then. Check out the other shows in the week. There's a lot of other content. I'm talking with Tarek on Friday. That'll be, I think, a really interesting conversation, so check that out. And I'll look forward to seeing you next week. Have a very good evening, and thanks for those super chats. Jason, appreciate your contribution tonight, as always, and everybody else's contribution in the chat as well. We'll see you next time. Take care.